And we're live.
Thank you. Good afternoon to my colleagues and to all of you who are joining us virtually. I am Delegate Vanessa Atterbury, and welcome to the first meeting of the House's Police Accountability and Reform Workgroup. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for your charge to all of us and for the trust you've placed in me to chair this workgroup. It's an honor. For those of you who don't know me, let me introduce myself. I am a Black woman. I am a daughter of a Black man and a Black woman. I am the sister of a Black man. I am the aunt of a Black and Latina niece and nephew. And most importantly in my life, I am the mother of 2 Black boys and 1 Black daughter. As many of you have experienced, I saw how society and the police treated my father and brother differently because of the color of their skin. Whether it was stopping my brother and his friends around the corner of our house asking, "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Whether it was continuously and intentionally harassing my father during his commute from work, or whether it was putting my brother face down on the pavement and accusing him of a crime. I myself was stopped, surrounded by 7 to 8 police vehicles and officers, and questioned while leaving a bank because a Black woman had committed a crime nearby. The murders of Freddie Gray, George Floyd, Rashard Brooks, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, and the many, many, many more other Black men and women killed and murdered at the hands of police in our country have left me too angry, sad, and frustrated. I worry for the future of my children and all of the other brown and Black children in our state and across the country. As a mother, as a legislator, the weight of our task weighs heavily upon me. The urgency of this task weighs heavily upon me. I am also the granddaughter of a Black woman who grew up in Selma, Alabama, and was later recruited to help humanize the Detroit police force. She retired as deputy sheriff of Wayne County, Michigan, and I know what it was like for her as an officer in her community, and particularly as a Black officer. I am also the niece of her brother, a Black man who grew up in Selma and went on to become Monsignor in the Catholic Church, but was also a staunch civil rights activist. He formed a behind-the-scenes partnership with the white mayor of Selma and convinced 11 white council members to approve electing council members by district instead of at large. That subsequently led to 5 Black members being elected for the first time to the council in Selma's history. He went on to broker the Selma Accord, which brought federal dollars to the city. He walked across the Mptsc Bridge that day in 1965 and helped organize the 10-year commemorative march in 1975. You can see my Uncle Sonny, Monsignor James Patrick Robinson, at Coretta Scott King's right side in that famous picture of the march, and John Lewis on her left. This is who I am. I want to thank my colleagues in advance for their work that they will do as we embark upon this journey together. I want to thank all of you who have reached out to me in support of my role as chair as we move forward together. My senator and friend once asked me when I was trying to make a decision about my path, do you want to make policy or do you want to make a point? The answer was easy. I have always been committed to doing the hard work of making impactful policy, just as I did in passing background checks for long guns, taking guns out of the hands of abusers, and strengthening laws to convict sexual predators. And I will bring that same passion, energy, and fighting spirit to help ensure that at the end of the day, the House passes legislation that is meaningful, impactful, and not from a checklist. I have committed my life to serving the community since I was a child, and public service is no different. I look forward to working collaboratively with members of this group, the community, and law enforcement. We have much work to do. And with that, we will now hear remarks from the Speaker of the House, Adrian Jones.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry that I could not join you at the beginning of this meeting, but I hope to join you later. I want to thank each of you for serving, and so many Marylanders for watching this first briefing today. We have reached a critically important time in our national conversation about reforming systemic injustice. Those three words, reforming, systemic, injustice, need to be more than just words for millions of Black Americans, their families, and their children. They also need to be more than just words for every Black and Brown Marylander. Each of you were selected to serve on this work group because you bring a different perspective and a different voice, but also because each of you recognize that change is necessary. As expected, I've already heard pushback from other leaders and advocates asking me why so many bills have failed, why now, and predicting we won't do enough. Let me be clear. This is not a philosophical conversation for me. This is personal. I am the sister of 4 Black brothers, the mother of 2 Black sons, and the grandmother to 2 Black children. And I too have experienced overreaction for driving while Black. I remember when a broken taillight led to 4 police cars surrounding my car one afternoon. When I asked why all of these officers were necessary, they told me, "We don't know if you have a weapon on you." I was a professional woman and a mother at this point in my life, working directly for the county executive. But a broken taillight required this reaction. I don't want my brothers and sons to fear for their children's future any longer. Together, we spent this past session, my first as speaker, focusing on breaking down barriers in our education system. That is a fight that we are not finished, but we know the path forward. Now I ask you to turn your eyes toward the issue of policing, law enforcement, and access to justice. I will be closely monitoring your work and have all confidence in Vice Chair Atterbury to include all of your voices in a tremendous final product, legislation for the 2021 session. I urge you to be creative and think beyond just the checklist of items that you think are important. I ask that you focus not just on improving the transparency and accountability of the system, but also how we can start to prevent some of these tragedies. People's lives literally depend on you. Thank you again for agreeing to serve. Now get to work.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And now we will begin with a presentation from the Department of Legislative Services on statutory changes relating to police reform from 2016 to the present. I would ask members that if you have any questions, please just note that you have a question in the chat box and I'll monitor it and you will be recognized and unmuted. So now Mr. Kenneth Weaver, I would like to thank you for being here and you are up.
All right, thank you so much, Delegate. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see all of you. I believe we have the summary document that's going to be on screen in a minute. So my name is Ken Weaver. Again, I'm a policy analyst at DLS, and today we're going to review police and public safety reform in Maryland since 2016. So we're going to start with the summary document with House Bill 1016, which had significant reforms, and this was the result of a joint House and Senate Public Safety and Policing work group. I would note that at the bottom of the summary document, if you do have a copy of the PDF, there is a footnote at the bottom that does link to the full work group report. So on page number 1, I'm going to talk about the 4 main recommendations of the legislation. The first main item is that HB 1016 reconstituted the Maryland Police Training and Standards Commission as an independent commission. So the MPTSC statewide oversees minimum police selection and training standards, and that's essentially what the legislation accomplished. Just a side note, the MPTSC's parent agency, which is the Police and Correctional Training Commissions, it has an $11 million budget, about 70 regular employees, and about $2 million in the Mptsc fund for fiscal 2021. The second main provision of the bill also made changes to the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. I'll be referring to that later on as LEOBR. Part number 3 is that the legislation created a community program fund within GOCAP to fund police community-facing programs. And in case anyone wants to see the list of programs funded, we do have that available for you as well. And the fourth main provision is that the legislation created a $5,000 state tax exemption for police who live in the area that they serve. So continuing on page number 1 of the document, there are several key requirements for the Mptsc. So first, there is a requirement for entrance level and in-service training. In-service training takes place every 3 years, and these are on anti-discrimination and use of force de-escalation. The agency must create use of force standards and best practices. The Mptsc is also required to create strategies to increase diversity in law enforcement and give a mandatory psychological evaluation of officers involved in an incident when another person was seriously injured or killed. I would note that when we talk about the training documents, the de-escalation, anti-discrimination, use of force standards, and diversity, all of these items as per law are required by Mptsc are featured on their website as the legislation had asked for. So moving on to page number 2, there are a few more additional requirements for the Mptsc. One of the key features here is that they must publish an annual report on serious officer-involved incidents. These mainly include cases of serious injury or death, excessive force, or criminal misconduct and or criminal charges on the part of the police officer. And it must publish the data on officers' discipline. This is statewide, across the state in terms of the officer provisions there. Another piece of this is that the Mptsc is required to develop best practices for community policing. So they do review each county's community policing program each year as well. The Mptsc must also develop a public complaint process in each county that's uniform statewide. They must also provide an MDH or Maryland Department of Health hotline so that officers can get counseling. And it also requires the Mptsc to require a psychiatric evaluation for police certification. And then lastly, on page 2, there's a provision that states that nonviolent police complaints can now go to a mediation program. So now to go over the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, or LEOBR. Major changes start at the bottom of page number 2 of the summary document. First provision states that no discrimination against officers who report police department or fellow officers' misconduct, malfeasance, or mismanagement could be permitted. Excessive force complaints no longer need to be notarized. Complaints can come from anyone who has recorded video evidence. That was a new provision. The deadline for filing excessive force complaints was moved up from 90 days to 366 days, essentially a year and a day. And in terms of administrative hearing boards, which hear police cases, those boards could now have up to 1 to 2 members of the public, and the Mptsc has to have training available for those civilian members. So moving on to pages 3 and 4, there's a little bit more information in terms of Maryland police policies and funding, and I'll just go through them as they are there in the document. The first is that all law enforcement policies must be published online. There is a provision for an early intervention or early warning system. This system basically states that officers who receive 3 or more complaints in a year are required to get non-punitive counseling. Another provision is that use of force reports must be filed by the end of the officer's shift. As I mentioned earlier about GOCAP, GOCAP is required to administer a community program fund. This is $500,000 every fiscal year, which will fund police community-facing activities. And then again, as I mentioned earlier in the summary, in the introduction rather, officers do qualify for a $5,000 tax exemption if they reside in the area they serve, but only if that area has an above average crime rate compared to the state average. So moving on to page 4 of the summary document, there are some additional public safety reforms for 2016, and I'll go over these by chapter. So chapters 658 and 619, they include significant reform to the seizure and forfeiture of property process for drug cases. There is also SB 233, which requires police training to avoid motorcyclist profiling. HB 1371 required the agency, that's Mptsc, to create lethality protocols regarding domestic violence and strangulation. This was additional training provisions. On page number 5 for 2017, chapters 158 and 159 require healthcare providers to give information to sexual assault victims on testing protocols and notification before destroying evidence. Chapters 802 and 3 require the Mptsc to develop SWAT team and no-knock warrant training. HB 1037 allows police complaints to the Baltimore Civilian Review Board to be filed within 1 year instead of 90 days. 2018 legislation goes on to the following pages, also on 5 and 6. Starting with SB 1099, this established the Commission to Restore Trust in Policing, which examined the Baltimore Police Department's gun trace task force. HB 190 changed Mptsc language standards for psychological evaluations. HB 1292 prohibits police from having sexual contact with those in their custody. For 2019, there are several provisions moving into pages 6 and 7. Senate Bill 81 required the Baltimore Police Department to report on GOCAP grants received. SB 210 required the state police to publicly link to a Department of Defense website which lists all military surplus transfers to Maryland police departments until 2022. That information is also available in a spreadsheet that we have available if any of the members would like to have that. Chapters 625 and 626 require the state to report on race-based traffic stops. Chapters 33 and 34 require sexual assault kits to be submitted for testing and creates several rules regarding transparency and timeliness. And on page number 8, chapters 459 and 460 extend the termination date for the Commission to Restore Trust in Policing to January 2021. HB 168 expands the categories of hate crime incidents. And HB 516 allows the Office of Legislative Audits to audit the Baltimore Police Department. And then lastly, on pages 8 and 9, in 2020, in terms of legislation, SB 140 expands OLA access to Baltimore police records and allows for multiple audits. That's a follow-up on the previous item that I just mentioned about BPD audits. Chapters 222 and 223 establish rules regarding police use of cell site simulators, also called stingrays, that can track and gather cell phone information. SB 807 prohibits law enforcement agencies from seeking waivers from victims of sexual assault. And then the final provisions for 2020 are HB 1111. This requires special police officers. Examples here include local, municipal, and campus police. It requires those type of officers to complete training that's approved by the Maryland State Police in consultation with the Mptsc. And HB 739 establishes the Law Enforcement Body Camera Task Force, which reports to the General Assembly by the end of this year. And the main issues there for their study include studying the cost of storing camera data and making recommendations regarding data storage. I would also note that the Mptsc does have a comprehensive document on body camera protocols, which is also available on their website. And here in the committee, we have copies of that for the committee as well. So that concludes our review of recent state reform in the state of Maryland. I know the Mptsc is going to be coming up soon to give us an update, but myself and the rest of the committee staff are happy to answer any questions anyone might have on the items that we had just mentioned.
Okay, Delegate Rosenberg has a question, and then Delegate Fisher. Delegate Rosenberg, 1 second.
Delegate Rosenberg, because you muted yourself, I have to ask you to unmute yourself.
Okay, Doug, fine, got it.
Sure. New features.
Okay. Mr. Weaver, you
Yes.
said that the law, our existing law says there can be no discrimination, if I heard you correctly, against an officer who reports a violation by another officer. What does that mean, no discrimination? And is there the specific code site?
Right. Well, what the law required is that procedure was in place. It essentially created a system that the Mptsc had to put forward that would make sure that no one would be unfairly punished for taking those steps. However, when it comes to the specifics of the actual anti-discrimination rules, I'd have to defer to the Mptsc on the particulars of what they have statewide.
So that's a question that I should ask them when they come up next.
Correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Delegate Fisher.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a question about, I think, going through all the bills that have already passed, there's a variation of issues that I think the committee is going to address. But the biggest concern for me is how the enforcement of the prior legislation has gone with our police departments. I think it's important for us as a committee to know when we do pass something, how is it enforced? And it seems to me that a lot of it just depends on the Training and the Standards Commission to enforce that on the departments. And I wanted to know if where is the bite throughout all of these bills? And if you can speak a little bit about, as we go through this work group, how can we legislate that bite and that accountability to enforce what we even have on the books right now?
Okay, is that question mainly for me? Because
Yeah.
I can answer part of it. I mean, in terms of the legislation and the bite, so to speak, that would be something for the committees to take up. But in terms of what we've seen with legislation, this all came in the wake of the Freddie Gray incident in Baltimore, as you know. So a lot of the provisions in the law were very significant for the state in terms of gathering together what needed to be done, different rules and different provisions. In terms of the actual details and in terms of the actual reporting requirements, that's a totally different issue. And I would definitely say that all of the items that I went through pretty much described exactly what happened in the legislation for those items. The rules were put out, but in terms of actually enforcing, that would be a different issue that was not always necessarily addressed in the previous legislation.
I think Delegate Fisher has a follow-up question.
So I guess I just wanted to have clarity in the bills that you've gone over and in the report. Is there anywhere that you can point to other than us depending on the Maryland Police and Training Standards Commission that provides accountability for any of these bills? That's really my question. Other than asking Maryland Police and Training Standards Commission to provide the accountability and produce, I don't want to waste time, but to produce all of the enforcement reports, is there anywhere in the past bills that has a different accountability measure, or it's just that?
I definitely could kind of defer to Claire on this one, but in terms of the knowledge that I have of these bills, there are simply administrative tasks given to Mptsc to kind of oversee all of this. And then there are definitely reporting requirements. For example, the ones that I mentioned about diversity, reviewing community policing, requirements to put certain items on the website for public dissemination. All of those are included in the legislation, and the Mptsc has put those out on the web. But in terms of someone actually going into those particulars and saying, hey, is this enough or not? That's another question. And also in terms of the idea that if some pieces are maybe not fulfilled within particular police departments, those are items that are not really addressed directly by the legislation currently. It just requires the Mptsc to report on that. And I'm sure they can give a little bit more context when they go up. But generally, I would say it's more reporting and overseeing what's happening in terms of what the police are required to do.
Okay. Delegate Fisher, do you have a follow-up? Are you good? Okay. Delegate Barnes has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And, Ken, thank you so much for the presentation. I just had a couple of questions and to piggyback off of Delegate Fisher. Based off of the Maryland Police Training and Standard Commission, you had mentioned about psych evaluations. Do we know how often those psych evaluations are given? And are they, and then when do they start?
Well, it's my understanding that the psychiatric evaluation is required for you to become a police officer. But in terms of ensuing psychiatric evaluations, they certainly do follow-ups on those when there's a serious officer-involved incident. For example, if there's a death, there are other evaluations that follow on for that. Outside of that, I would defer to Mptsc in terms of if there are any additional psychiatric evaluations or requirements in that regard.
Right, so I guess that's my concern, that to become a police officer, you have to have that psych evaluation, but there's no continuous psych evaluation on an annual basis or quarterly or whatever the case may be.
Oh, I see what you mean, like in a regular fashion. Not that I'm aware of outside of particular significant incidents, but again, I would defer to the Mptsc on that if they would correct that.
Yeah. All right, and that's fine. That's just a concern for me, because a police officer is dealing with so much trauma and mental anguish every day, and they only get that psych evaluation when they first become a police officer is somewhat concerning. My second question, Madam Chair, is on page 5 under SB 941, and I guess you had talked about the training. How often is that training and how long is that training?
Okay, you're talking about the civilian training?
Correct.
Potential civilian training. Yeah, okay, on that one, I would refer to Mptsc, and that would vary depending on the different police departments. I would also note that in the provisions stated, it does state that one civilian member can be part of a board, but under particular circumstances, that number could grow to 2. But it does just require the Mptsc to have training available for these people if and when the situation arises. So I would defer to them to give you more detail on that.
Okay, so right now there's no standardized training requirement for that.
No.
Okay, and I have one more on page 8, House Bill 516. Which gives audits for Baltimore police departments. There is no other audits that we have for other agencies or police departments throughout the state of Maryland?
Well, I would just say that this specific one, because this was done in the wake of Freddie Gray, this was seen as a significant, important thing to review. So not that other agencies were left out of the loop, but it was just that the legislation focused on this one particular piece.
Okay. I have other questions, but thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, Delegate McComas and then Delegate Schlega. McComas, one moment, you're muted. There you go.
This is just following up on Delegate Fisher's. I was wondering if there's performance audits that are done within the police departments, or if they're seeking accreditation, there's going to be like a national accreditation of your jail or a state accreditation. Usually there's a lot of compliance to do different things. And I'm wondering if that would be a vehicle to have more performance audits, because we're not really talking about money. We're talking about, how the policies and procedures are put into place and how they're executed. And that's really required, that's different. And the way it is now, and this is just an impression, is that if there's a problem, somebody has to report it. that there's a problem with a certain type, let's say a no-knock warrant policy or something. So, and sometimes people won't do that for various reasons. So I'm thinking that, you know, there may be more problems or there aren't problems. It's just, we really don't know because nobody who really is an expert has done a performance audit on some of these issues. That's, and I don't know anything about performance audits, but I think that they're much different, and they really do a deep dive, and they kind of follow people around and see how policies and procedures are executed on the street.
So is there a question in there, Delegate McComas?
Well, the question is, are there any performance audits within the police agencies now?
Okay.
So that's the question.
Okay.
Okay, so again, that one definitely would be an Mptsc question. I would definitely say that in terms of overall performance, and Mr. Liebno can correct me if I'm wrong, the different agencies all have various standards that they must comply by, that are issued by the Mptsc, and there are a variety of mechanisms there. And the Mptsc does basically check in with all of these departments on a continuous basis throughout the year, but the law only requires them to report on specific aspects. For example, community policing. So the Mptsc will certainly review the community policing programs within each of the different departments around the state, and they will put that in a report as per the legislation. And so that is put out for dissemination. But in terms of what you're saying, in terms of a deep dive audit type of situation, for example, what's happening right now with OLA, they're doing a financial audit of the Baltimore City Police Department. So that's going to be much more wide-ranging and comprehensive. Whereas what the Mptsc does is they have rules that everyone agrees on, and they make sure everyone sticks to those rules. So I would say in that fashion, it kind of is like an audit in a sense that the Mptsc does conduct. But you're talking about more of a deep dive and something that I would say something like the audit, where once the results are in, people can then look at that, tear that down and say, oh, well, is this enough? Or, hey, does there need to be another particular provision for community policing, or perhaps no-knock warrant training, you know, something like that, that's maybe a lot more qualitative. I would probably say that I get where you're coming from on that, that would be something maybe a little bit different. But again, I would reiterate that the Mptsc does have requirements, and they do require every police department to be in compliance with the various rules. If the rules need to be changed, obviously that would be something the committees would certainly take up.
Before moving on to our next question, I would just like to welcome Madam Speaker, who has joined us. So welcome. And the next question is from Delegate Schlega and then Delegate Acevedo. You're unmuted, but we still can't hear you. Now it looks like you're muted again. I'm not sure. If you want to type your question in the chat box, then maybe we can ask it, or send follow-up questions while we figure out what's going on there. Delegate Acevedo.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ken, for the presentation. Just two quick questions. One is, does Maryland have a law limiting use of force? And two, do you know how many other states do not have statutes limiting use of force?
Okay, well, the second part is we are gathering information about what other states are doing in terms of use of force. So certainly I could get back to you on that. But in terms of what the state does have, they do have a particular use of force rules and requirements. There is a document that is on their website that we as the committee do have that we could also forward to you, that lays out all of the different provisions that the use of force requirements have to cover. And part of that does require de-escalation training. So I would certainly defer to the Mptsc to talk more about the details of the type of training and requirements that they have for each of the particular police departments in the state.
Okay, Vanessa, are you good?
Yes.
Okay. So Delegate Schlega put this question in, Ken, so I'm going to just read it from the chat. On page 2, quote, develop a system for annual reporting to the Mptsc by each law enforcement agency on the number of serious officer involved incidents, end quote. Can we get access to these reports, or are they on the web somewhere?
Yes, they're on the web, and also the committee. We will forward that to you. We can certainly forward to you after the call. We have a list of all of the Mptsc reports that are available. We have them in PDF form, and we also have a simple list of links so that people can check each of the different points by category on the Mptsc website, including that report on serious officer involved incidents. I believe the last 2 were for 2018 and 2017 and 2018 on the website. 2019 is supposed to be coming in the next several months. And I would also point out that we do also have a report by GOCAP. GOCAP has serious officer incidents that have resulted in death. And that is a report that's required by, I believe, HB 954 from a couple of years ago. So that's a totally different report that has similar information about excessive force incidents. So we can certainly get all of that to the committee for you to go over.
Thank you. Thank you. Delegate Davis has a question.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Mhm.
Yes, I want to follow up on Delegate Schlege's question about reporting. Ken said that he would send us the information from about the reporting of serious incidents. I want to speak to that report. Has every agency responded?
As far as I'm aware, every agency has responded. However, I would say that the report itself does not break down the serious officer involved incidents by agency. It just has a collection of the numbers statewide and the numbers of officers disciplined.
Could I follow up, please, Madam Chair? And is there a penalty if you don't respond?
I'm not aware of a penalty for that. And certainly in the legislation, there's no mention of that.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions? Delegate Acevedo typed in, is there someone from Mptsc that can respond to whether we have a law limiting the use of force? They were up next, so we can ask them that question. Any other questions for Mr. Weaver? If not, thank you very much for presenting to us today. And that concludes his presentation. Next, we do have the Mptsc, who's probably heard a lot of questions that are going to be coming their way already. And I don't know who wants to begin, Mr. Labino or Sheriff Troy. Thank you both for being here, and you both can take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Atterbury and members of the work group to address police reform and accountability in Maryland. And to the delegates, a number of your questions I hope we'll be able to answer during our presentation. We do have a PowerPoint in reference to that. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Sheriff Berry. I'm Sheriff of Charles County, and I am the acting chair of the Police Training and Standards Commission. And with me today is Mr. Albert Liebno, and Al is the acting executive director of the Maryland Police and Correctional Training Commission. We understand the purpose of this work group is to review both the policies and procedures governing the investigation of police misconduct, including the Maryland Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights statute and the use of body cams and body camera footage. We also understand the work group will consider how uniform statewide use of force policies and arrest procedures would work and identify the national best practices for independent prosecution of law enforcement related crimes. We appreciate this opportunity to address the work group today. Just to let the work group understand that the commission is a body that continually reminds agencies of various statutory and regulatory requirements. And from a historical point, the last major reform for police in Maryland resulted from the passage of, as we heard today, House Bill 1016 during the 2016 legislative sessions. These reforms resulted in significant changes to the Police Training and Standards Commission, and it was reconstituted from the original Police Training Commission established by legislation in 1966 to the new commission as it stands today. The actions resulting from the reconstitution of the Police Training and Standards Commission into the Police Training and Standards Commission is included in a change in both the leadership and also in membership. As you can see on the slide, the current Police and Training Standards Commission is comprised of 24 members representing various aspects of law enforcement, as well as representatives from the Senate, House, and the community. The membership of the commission understands the seriousness of the powers and duties bestowed upon them. This can be seen in the response of the commission to the mandates that have been accomplished since the passage of House Bill 1016 in 2016. I would like to provide an update about the actions the commission has taken in regard to the bill that has been enacted beginning of 2016. If we could go on to slide number 3, please. We're going to talk about administrative hearings. When an administrative hearing board is convened, a police agency in the state can have a citizens member may receive training, which we talked about earlier, from the Police Training and Standards Commission on law enforcement officer Bill of Rights and also matters relating to police procedures. The law enforcement officers Bill of Rights training is available upon request. However, the commission has not received any requests for training for civilian hearing board members through today's date. So again, that training is available, and we can get into the number of hours of that training for our citizen members. If we could go on to slide number 4. There was some question about use of force practices. We would like the work group to understand officers are encouraged and trained to diffuse rather to intensify confrontations with and between citizens. When time and circumstances and safety permits, officers would take steps or are encouraged to take steps to gain compliance and control a situation rather than using physical force. Also, in the entry level of our academies, the commission has laid out particular parameters where officers are given training in the proper level of use of force. Law enforcement agencies are required to conduct annual in-service training on legal aspects in the use of firearms, including rules for the use of deadly force and alternatives, and that's found in the COMAR. And with the understanding that officers are encouraged, again, to diffuse situations, practice de-escalation. Also, best practices and standards for the use of force were identified and posted on the commission's website, and that information can be found at mdle.net. Again, that's mdle.net. And a copy of this document is being provided to all the work group members as a handout. And I want to make it very clear. We would also like to advise the committee that chokeholds are not taught in any use of force curriculum or approved by the commission. In addition, the published best practices include the standard to duty to intervene. So we do have best practices that officers are taught to intervene. Slide number 5, please. The commission has worked to evaluate and modernize recruitment standards and practices of law enforcement agencies to increase diversity within law enforcement and develop strategies for recruiting, such as women, African Americans, Hispanics, Latinos, and other minority candidates. Maryland police agencies have informal recruiting network, and these recruiters were convened and we had discussion about best practices and options for recruitment. Best practices include developing long-term relationships with minority communities, share recruitment information about qualified candidates with other agencies, and when a candidate cannot be immediately hired due to the length of the academy, we work with one another. And we also had some conversation in reference to the review of drug standards. Ultimately, recruitment and hiring of all officers is with agencies who are abiding by the minimum standards of the commission, and the standards are reviewed and discussed on a regular basis by the commission. And at this time, I would like Mr. Liebno to give some insight and overview in reference to the minimum standards for a law enforcement applicant.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee work group. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to address these important factors. As Sheriff Berry has mentioned, the commission has a list of requirements an individual must have before they're eligible for officer certification. Therefore, in most cases, the agencies use this also for employment selection standards. First, they have to be 21 years of age. Citizenship, they have to either be a U.S. citizen or a permanent legal resident who has served in the military with an honorable discharge. A high school diploma or GED. They have to be eligible to possess and use a handgun. There has to be a background criminal history investigation, which includes a determination of a good moral character and reputation, emotionally stable, displays behavior necessary to perform duties of a police officer, military records check, interviews, including personal references, neighbors within the last 5 years, and co-workers within the last 5 years. As Sheriff Berry mentioned, the commission has addressed prior drug use, and there is a requirement that has to be investigated and validated by a truth verification process, which normally is either a polygraph or a voice stress analyzer. And then finally, criminal records check through both Maryland and the FBI.
And if we could go on to slide number 6, please. Thank you. We had to implement a system for law enforcement agencies to annually report the commission the number of serious officer-involved incidents, and we talked about that, and the number of officers disciplined every year. The reporting process was implemented at the beginning of 2017, and agency heads were notified of the requirement. Agency heads are notified annually via email, in some cases even by phone. In addition, an email is sent to the individual who is listed as having submitted the report for the previous year. The report includes total number of serious officer-involved incidents and officer discipline. It's submitted to the governor's office annually and is published on the commission's website. The language was introduced by the commission in the 2020 legislative session to establish parameters around reporting, including a deadline for all reports to be submitted by January 31st of every year. The bill, House Bill 1144, also include revisions to the public safety article. And while it was passed in the House, it was referred to the Senate and no action was taken due to the shortened legislative session. Slide number 7, please. Safe Call Now was identified as a confidential hotline for all Maryland public safety first responders and their families. The Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, now the Department of Health, participated with the commission to identify Safe Call Now. Safe Call Now is staffed by trained peer public safety personnel and mental health professionals. The founder of Safe Call Now has conducted training for officers in Maryland. And I will say that training has been very well received, and that training occurred in the calendar years of 2018 and 2019. Slide 8, please. House Bill 1016 required the Public Training and Standards Commission to establish a police complaint mediation program to which law enforcement agencies may refer nonviolent complaints made against officers. And again, that's nonviolent complaints made against officers. A sample mediation policy for law enforcement agencies is posted on the commission's website along with a community member. And we also was given a police complaint mediation reference guide. The commission received guidance and input from the Community Mediation of Maryland and also the House of Delegates. Slide 9, please. In reference to community-oriented policing, community policing was established, we had established best practice, and the commission developed a system by which local law enforcement agencies filed a detailed description about its community policing programs. Agencies were provided a guiding document that identified community policing. It also talked about the description of the purpose and scope of community policing. It gave a description of the key components of community policing and explained the 4 principal elements of community policing. And lastly, it listed the 10 guiding principles. The reports are submitted annually and in accordance with the set schedule to allow significant time for them to be reviewed and analyzed. And the schedule for submission by the region can be reviewed on this particular slide. As you can see, Region 1 is scheduled to be done in January, Region 2 is in April, Region 3 is in July, and Region 4 is in October. Examples of the community policing practice that have been posted on the MDLE Net website. Slide number 10, please. Uniform citizen complaint process. The commission at its January 8, 2019 meeting adopted requirements to be incorporated to each law enforcement agency's uniform citizen complaint process. At its April 8, 2020 meeting, the Police Training and Standards Commission updated these requirements. The primary steps guiding the process as shown on the slide. In addition, anyone making a complaint should expect any available senior ranking officer to take a verbal complaint. And if that individual does not want to be contacted by an officer, an agency employee will take that complaint. If a complaint is made in writing, the complainant will be provided a contact person in the agency, and the complainant may expect at minimum monthly updates regarding the status of the complaint. And that's provided if the person gave their contact information. A complaint will be notified of the outcome of a complaint within 72 hours of that particular disposition of that complaint. And just to let the work group understand, a complaint can be received externally, meaning by a citizen. We can have an internal complaint where an officer sees some kind of misconduct and launch a complaint. And we also investigate or suggest in policy that anonymous complaints are also investigated. Slide number 11, please. Language was also added regarding the commission to approve psychologists who were conducting mental health screenings as a component of the selection standards in COMAR. The commission researched what is meant to approve a psychologist to conduct psychological evaluation as opposed to having one voice represent the entire profession. The resulting actions include the passage of House Bill 190 during the 2018 legislative session and the adoption of new COMAR language. And that language dealt with the definitions and also the selecting standards that align the qualifications of professionals conducting psychological assessments with the standards established by the Maryland Department of Health in regard to the licensings and qualifications. Well, ultimately, the commission determined that the licensed mental health professionals were better qualified to determine who could conduct psychological assessments. Next slide, please. In reference to use of force reports, each law enforcement agency shall require a law enforcement officer who was involved in a use of force incident and allotted duty to file an incident report regarding the use of force by the end of the officer's shift, unless the officer was disabled. And it should be noted that use of force reports are the property of each respective agency and remains within that agency. And my last and final slide. The posting of official policies, including public complaint procedures and collective bargaining agreements, was done, and that information has been posted on a hyperlink on the MDLE Net website under Maryland Police Policies tab. And that is a kind of like overview of the accomplishments of the Maryland Police Standards and Training Commission, and myself and Mr. Levno would be available to take questions from the work group.
Thank you very much. I just have a couple of just quick initial questions. We have, I think that you sent a copy of the slides. We're getting requests for the slides. Can you send that to the work group?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So going back to the best practices that were implemented after the H Bill 1016, how many departments in Maryland have actually implemented these best practices?
Mr. Levno, would you be able to give an overview of some of the correspondence that you had with some of the agencies across the state?
Absolutely, thank you. The commission was, as Mr. Weaver mentioned in his presentation, was responsible to develop those best practices. What was not in the commission's requirement was to actually monitor or audit, for lack of a better term, the implementation of that. So that I have no idea at this point how many have actually implemented them.
So someone would have to, in essence, reach out to each department and ask them if they had implemented them? Is that what would have to happen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And if that's something the committee would like the commission to do, we could assist you in that.
Okay, thank you. I think we would be interested in that. And Delegate Anderson sent me the question that I'm going to ask for him. What % of Maryland police agencies are using body-worn cameras right now?
And I'm sure Sheriff Barry is going to want me to answer that too, Madam Chair. The commission does not track the use of or purchase of body-worn cameras.
Okay, so that's something else that would have to be kind of an investigation with each and every police department in the state to see.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Delegate Fisher has a question, and then Delegate Moon.
Thank you so much for the presentation, gentlemen. I have a two-part question, and I think for this first meeting, I'm really about the chain of accountability and responsibility. So I could get into a lot of why, in a lot of the commission, the chiefs appoint things, but when it comes to the citizens on the review boards, what was either the rationale or why don't they have a vote like everyone else on there? If any of you could speak to why the citizen member who's usually appointed by the chief of police is not, they go through the training, but then they don't have a vote.
Sheriff, I'll let you address that.
Yeah, Delegate Fisher, I think that basically the sheriff's office and law enforcement agencies across the state are simply just following the law in reference to that. As you very much are aware, House Bill 1016 was a transparency bill. And there's a number of things that came on along in reference to bringing that transparency. And one of the questions that I remember through some of the sessions that the citizen was saying that a lot of the decisions were made behind closed doors. So House Bill 1016 gave individuals access to the process. And I don't know pretty much the rationale. It just didn't come through legislation in reference to why there wasn't a voting member on that particular board.
Do you have a follow-up, Delegate Fisher? Okay. Delegate Moon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks for joining us today. And officers, so please don't take this in too adversarial a fashion, but I have some questions that I have to be honest come from a point of skepticism. And it sounds clear that we've sort of set up a regime where we're doing rules without teeth or ensuring that they're being implemented. So I guess my first question is there any reason we should not use more tools to compel police departments to successfully implement the minimum standards we already have and to push those departments to create penalties on individual officers, actual penalties, who violate those rules? And secondly, don't we need to be more specific about what rules we want at this point? I'll give you the one example where I put in a bill with Senator Smith a few years ago. It was the SWAT no-knock warrant rule. And we asked you all we had a very specific goal of reducing unnecessary violence. We asked you to make rules. And I just looked at the rules again. And it says if it's reasonable, you can do this as long as the officers have been trained. And clearly that's not what we intended. But maybe that's what happens when we hand the rulemaking off to a body composed mostly of law enforcement with no teeth. So sorry, I don't mean that to be adversarial. It's an actual question. Why shouldn't we be more specific and make much more of a strong requirement system at this point? Thank you.
Delegate Moon, thank you very much for your involvement in the work group, and also thank you for the question. In reference to the SWAT bill, there was a number of things that came out of conversation and legislation. As you much are aware, that we have to do annual reporting on SWAT usage in reference to no-knock warrants and things of that nature. But you are aware in reference to search warrants, those are things that have to be brought before judges, and judges give us authorization whether to do no-knock warrants or not. But there is a provision in the law with their exigent circumstances and officers allowed to use that if there's some source of violence or something that the officers see in that particular scenario, and make sure that everyone stays safe to be able to do a no-knock warrant. I know you're very much aware with that. So we have a lot of reporting requirements, and I can speak specifically to my agency. In reference to that, we have a threat assessment. Before we can use our emergency response team, we have a threat assessment. And you have to meet certain requirements or certain criteria for you be able to deploy a SWAT team. And I know, and having spoke to a number of sheriffs, a number of chiefs across the state, we use a threat assessment. So it isn't just anytime that you have a warrant that you can use your, which we call here at Charles County Emergency Response Team or SWAT team. So through years of conversation and dialogue with the General Assembly, there has been some accountability piece in reference to making sure that we report these usages, and also putting forth some threat matrix, and that not being able to deploy our SWAT or emergency response teams on every search warrant.
Okay, Delegate Rosenberg.
My question sort of piggybacks on what Delegate Moon just asked, and that is, perhaps this should be directed to the chair, and then to our staff, is to what extent, or the commission, to what extent do jurisdictions have standards for the duty to intervene? And what are the standards in other jurisdictions, in other states, with regard to the duty to intervene and the consequences, both for the officer who does not intervene, or even benefit to an officer who does intervene, as the law may require?
Delegate Rosenberg, just to kind of let you know, having conversations with other sheriffs and also other chiefs, just last Friday, here in the Southern Maryland region, myself and Sheriff Cameron in St. Mary's County and Sheriff Evans in Calvary County, we had a regional law enforcement summit to talk about those very specific issues and what you're talking about in reference to policies. And one of the things that came up was the duty to intervene. And we also, in the Tri-County area, in the Southern Maryland region, we also have an academy. And we have been listening to citizens. We've been listening to our legislatures. So we have visit our training in our academy and our entry-level programs to talk about those particular situations. And we have decided to come up with particular scenario-based situations to address what you're very much talking about. You can create a scenario where an officer must, one of the characteristics that we're looking for, that they must intervene in those particular situations. We did a comprehensive, all three agencies did a comprehensive review of our use of force policy, and specifically put verbiage. We had verbiage in there, but we want to make sure that we put some additional language so it's very clear to bring to our staff members what is expected of them when they're particularly in the field. So there has been a whole host of conversation. I was just on a conference call with the Maryland Sheriff Association yesterday, talking about these best practices and what we are talking about here today. How do we move forward? How do we move law enforcement forward in the great state of Maryland in these specific areas? But that conversation is definitely being talked about amongst the chiefs, and I know it's been talked about amongst the sheriffs.
I very much appreciate that. I would suggest that for our work group, that also be something that we discuss, whether there should be a statewide standard. But what's going on in Southern Maryland obviously will benefit that. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Espero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sheriff Berry, thank you for your presentation. I want to come back to just some remarks in your presentation. You mentioned that law enforcement are encouraged where possible to de-escalate, and I want to revisit my earlier question. So to be clear, Maryland does not have a law or statute limiting use of force, correct?
Limiting use of, we basically have various use of force training that we give officers in reference to scenario based. But that's kind of like a broad question. What is it specifically? We have sheer presence to, unfortunately, if you have to use a firearm. Then we have various trainings in between where we talk about de-escalation, where we talk about empty hand tactics, where we talk about sheer presence, where we talk about something that we train staff members to use your words to de-escalate. So it is, we have, again, under the training commission, we have the best practices that agencies will tailor to their specific agency. So again, it goes with just what I said in my presentation, that it's always encouraged not to use physical force, but during those particular times, use a minimum amount of force to accomplish a justifying law goal.
Right, and I certainly understand that, and thank you for explaining that again. So I guess what I'm asking is, do we have a statute or a law, right, outside of what you're talking about, that limits use of force, that provides standards for when use of force, use of excessive or deadly force is justified? I'm hearing training, but I guess what I'm trying to find out is, do we have a statute or a law limiting use of force?
We have a framework. The goal in I think the mandate of the training commission is create a framework. I can speak to your point. There's not a unified use of force matrix in all the agencies in the state of Maryland. I can only tell you what's going in here in the Charles County Sheriff's Office. Hopefully I'm answering your question.
So yes, I think what I took from that is that we do not have a state law or statute limiting use of force. Correct?
I would say that in reference to the training commission, we give best practices. Hopefully that's answering your question.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, Delegate Sample Hughes, Speaker Pro Tem Sample Hughes.
Sure, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all that are here today participating in this very informative work group. The question, I have two actually, just one starting with the de-escalation. I was just recently informed about a training called Close Quarters Defense. And the question for Sheriff Berry is do you find that this training is beneficial or has been, or are you aware of it? Because I've heard that it's been trained in some agencies here in Maryland, but it's my understanding that it's been a quite useful tool. And if we are looking for standards so we can actually measure the success, I was thinking that in fact may be one of them. My second question is, you had referenced the community policing efforts and when those will be looked at based on the region. So I recall, years ago, I was working in the community with the Hotspots initiative. That initiative, as you're probably aware, had many components. One certainly being the fact that the community was at the helm. They were a part of the true community policing and meeting with the officers on a regular basis. Is that one of the components within the community policing efforts that's going to be looked at? And if so, will they be, what will happen if some of these components are not there in these plans?
Thank you for the question, Delegate Hughes. In reference to the training, specific training that you're talking about, we have a number of similar trainings, maybe called something different. I'm not specifically aware of that training, but I think speaking on behalf of law enforcement in the state of Maryland, we're open to any additional training that we will be able to use to, one, de-escalate and diffuse any situations in our community. And I will defer to Mr. Liebno in reference to maybe he could talk about some of the key components and also the 4 principal elements and also the 10 guideline principles of community-oriented policing. And I think that should answer your question.
Thank you, Delegate Hughes, for providing that question dealing with community policing. Part of the program or review process that we have set up do go with the points that Sheriff Berry presented before. The purpose and the scope, the 4 principal elements of community policing, the 10 guiding principles that were drawn from the experts across the country, such as PERF, IACP, the 21st Century Report, assisted the commission in coming up with those guidelines. And 2020 is actually the second year that our staff is reviewing each agency that is required to submit or have a community policing program, is submitting their programs to us for review. And if the program doesn't have what is listed in those bullet points that we previously presented, then the staff writes back to the agency and notifies them that they are missing that particular component, and would they revise their program and get back to us.
Okay. And if they are still missing it, what is the consequence?
Well, the commission is responsible to review it. There is beyond asking the agency to bring their community policing program up to the standard guidance that the commission presented. That's where we stop.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you.
Let's see if Delegate Schlegel's mic is working now.
Do we have volume?
Yes.
Thank you. I don't know if this is the right place to ask this, but I had asked previously about the reporting of officer-involved incidents, and they said it's on the website. So I went look on the website. There's no detail. It just says, the direct officer contact that resulted in serious injury or death of the officer or person 26. So can we get detail on those 26 incidents? There's like 4 other categories on there, or we only have access to the final number?
Thank you, Delegate. I appreciate that question. The breakdown behind that report that we published on the website is the numbers of a particular category, which you have the totals for the state that you're seeing on the website. We do have the breakdown numerically for each agency's report. Beyond that, we do not receive any additional data.
Where can we get the breakdown?
We can provide that. I can have that provided to the committee.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks.
Delegate Davis?
Yes, I would like to turn the attention to the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. The previous speaker mentioned the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights and some things that we've done recently to change it. I want to ask either gentleman, whoever would like to ask, whoever would like to answer, how many states in the United States have a Law Enforcement Bill of Rights?
Delegate Davis, I would have to get back with you. I would defer to Mr. Liebno. Maybe he's more well-versed in the number of states who have a law enforcement officer Bill of Rights, but we can definitely research that for you.
And I'm going to have to say the same thing, Delegate, that I don't have that data, but certainly research and get back to you.
If I could follow up, would either of you be surprised that only 16 states in the United States have a Law Enforcement Bill of Rights? Okay. If that statute was repealed, I want you to weigh in on this. Would that affect the employment rights of officers?
The employment rights of officers?
Yep.
I would have to see the document and how it would be formed, Delegate, in reference to how would the document would, I don't know what are you talking about? Are we talking about subpoena power? Or are we talking about investigatory power? I don't know.
If I could interrupt, I'm sorry. I'm talking about a complete repeal. If you no longer had it, would officers still have employment rights?
I would have to defer to legal counsel in reference to that.
Okay. And you know what? And if I could, for people that are watching, I just want that Maryland was one of the first people to establish a law enforcement bill of rights. And it gives police officers special rights when they're being disciplined and prevents communities from investigating misconduct that could lead to discipline. I just think that's really important for citizens to know how important that statute is. And it does other things, but I just want to make that clear. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Delegate Davis. And I just want to mention for the work group and for everyone who has joined us virtually that we will have an entire session on the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, and there will be experts on that there. So those questions certainly can be asked at that time. Also, the slides that were presented, it's my understanding the PDF has been put in the chat for the work group, and they are also on the Mptsc's website. So I have a couple questions. I don't see anyone else that has any more questions. If you do, please let me know. I am shocked that no one has requested training to be on the civilian review boards. Is that the fact that there has to be training and the fact that citizens can participate if approved by the chief, is that advertised in any way? Are you aware of that?
I would defer to Mr. Liebno in reference to that. Mr. Liebno, have you been getting requests from any other chiefs and sheriffs in reference to getting civilians trained?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, we did get some inquiries right after the commission developed the protocols and the, I guess for lack of a better term, a model program content. But after that, nobody has reached out to the commission to ask for that training. We are ready to provide that training upon any request that we receive.
Okay, thank you. And in your opinion, would it be best suited for the local police departments to take on advertising that citizens could in fact participate if they wanted to, and that there's this training available and they would have to seek that training? Is that something the police departments would do as opposed to your agency?
Well, actually, the police departments would request the training after they identify folks that would serve on their hearing boards. So it wouldn't be training that would per se come directly from the public, because there is some variance when you deal with the policies of each agency. Granted, it's not the majority of the training that would be given, but there is some related specifically to each agency individually. So we would accept the request through the agency.
Okay.
Mr. Liebno, can you also give the number of hours for that training? Because I think that was one of the delegates' questions in reference to that civilian training for law enforcement practices.
Okay, the program we have put together is 40 hours. However, it can be expanded to as many hours as necessary to cover the policies and administrative requirements of a particular agency.
Okay. As part of the best practices that you have recommended, or that any agency, local police department might employ, is there anything related to physical fitness and how often an officer might have to undergo a fitness test? Because I would just imagine that if an officer was, fit when they became an officer, and then 8 years later, they're not as fit as they were and they can't necessarily chase after someone, they might draw their weapon, their gun or a taser to use instead of of chasing that individual. So are there any requirements related to physical fitness for officers? And if so, how often they would have to undergo a PT type test?
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. There are physical requirements, testing, training that are required for the rookies, the recruits that come on. However, the commission does not have any established standards for physical fitness within later in their career. That is left up to the employment requirements of each agency.
So that differs by each agency?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
And Delegate, just kind of give you an overview. I've spoken to a number of sheriffs and chiefs. There are programs which we call wellness programs for our staff members. And just kind of give you an example here in Charles County, we do give an annual physical fitness test where there is some running done and some other push-up setups and some other measurements that we take. And it is also incentive based. If you perform well on, there's a monetary amount that you can get. So it's tiered. And we also revamped a number of our gyms in reference to encouraging our staff members to be more physically fit and more physically involved. So there was a number of agencies throughout the state that encourage those particular wellness programs.
Okay, thank you. A question was sent to me by Delegate Fisher. What is the budget for your commission?
For the Maryland Police and Correctional Training Commission, it's about $10 million. It's about $10 million.
Annually?
Yes, ma'am, annually. And then the commission itself has a law enforcement training fund that was established 2 years ago by the legislature of $2 million a year that is being used to upgrade, and bring new, not only equipment, but also new practices to the training arena for the commission.
Okay, thank you. I see Delegate Barnes has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a couple of questions. Can you tell me, how does the commission enforce and make other police departments uphold some of the standards that you guys have set?
Thank you for that question. But the commission, as we've already mentioned before, is saddled or given the responsibility to develop the standards, and in many cases, the standards or best practices is what's published out and is anticipated or expected that the agencies would comply with those. The commission has not been given the authority to go and per se enforce them.
So you would need for us to create legislation for you guys to have enforceable powers?
If that's what the legislature would prefer, yes, sir.
Yeah, because I was just listening to the presentation and I have several discrepancies, especially when you talk about the racial disparities within some of our police departments. My police department here in Prince George's County has just been hit with a large 94-page document of some of their infractions. And I'm just trying to understand how is this commission holding them accountable for certain things.
And again, Delegate, just to the same points of Mr. Liebno, in my opening remarks, we're just a statutory and a regulatory kind of commission. We just offer best practices in reference to respective organizations in the state.
So what will be your recommendation, Chief? Sheriff, as we look at some of these infractions that a lot of these police departments are having?
Again, if there's desire of the General Assembly to have some type of regulatory body, that would just have to be done through some type of statute or through legislation.
Thank you.
Next, Delegate Acevero for the second bite is the apple, as we say in judiciary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the indulgence. My question is for Mr. Liebnoll. Everyone seems to be getting a straightforward answer on here except for me. So my question, if I'm hoping you could answer, are you aware or do you know if there is a Maryland state law statute that limits use of force or in essence sets a standard when it is appropriate and justified to use force or excessive force. Are you aware? Yes or no?
Well, it's a little hard, Delegate, to answer that question, yes or no, to be honest with you, sir, because each scenario provides a different situation to be considered and handled and evaluated. The Graham case set a standard for police across the country to use deadly force and a level of force. But as far as a particular rule or statute that per se would say at a given situation, this is the amount of force that can be used, and anything above that would be prohibited, I'm not aware of any such thing.
Thank you. So to be clear, we do not as a state have a law or statute limiting use of force. Thank you.
Madam Speaker has a question.
Yes, thank you. This is for the Chief. Do you believe that there should be specific implicit bias training for officers prior to the hiring, to weed them out prior to they are officially on board?
Madam Speaker, any training in reference to implicit bias, de-escalation, I think it should be not only in the initial stages of law enforcement, but throughout an officer's career. And I can only speak about my agency and other agencies near. A lot of this training is occurring, bias-based profiling, but I think to the point that you're making, is all we can done in all aspects at the entry level of law enforcement and also through the officer's entire career.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions? I see Delegate Anderson literally waving his hand. Delegate Anderson. You're on mute. Hold on one second.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, there you go.
Okay. I just want to follow up on the questions asked by Delegate Acevero. Sheriff Barry, you understand that Baltimore City currently is under a consent decree imposed by the Department of Justice and a federal judge. Is that, you know that, right?
Yes, sir.
And as part of that consent decree, they have created a 11-page document titled Use of Force that not only includes the times and the amounts of force that can be used, but also includes the types of force, whether it's chemical, physical, guns, things like that. Have you had a chance to review the Baltimore City use of force provisions?
No, I haven't, sir.
Could you do us a favor? It's on their website. Could you take a look at it and make a determination, or somebody in your office, make a determination as to whether or not we could use that document as a boilerplate for a statewide use of force policy that Delegate Acevero has been talking about, and with which I agree. But we would want to vet at least the Baltimore City document first, and obviously you or your staff would be the best place to go to do that.
Yes, sir. We'll make it a point to review that.
Okay. And could you do it within the next 10 days? Is that possible?
I don't see why we couldn't. I think myself, Mr. Liebenow, and staff can look at the document.
Okay. My next question is, does the Maryland Police Training and Standards Commission have a database of police officers or potential police officers, people who have come to Maryland to apply to become police officers, a database of those officers who may have been fired or have resigned from agencies outside of the state of Maryland?
I defer to Mr. Liebenow with that question, sir.
Thank you, Delegate Anderson. We don't have a database, but there is a database that is being maintained by the International Association of Directors of Law Enforcement Standards and Training, ADLIS, that's titled the National Decertification Index. There is where we go and review to see if anyone from out of state is in fact had an issue in another state. Also, the selection background investigation standards that are required to be completed by each of our agencies when they hire a person, regardless of whether the person has never been in police work, whether they work for another rental agency or another state agency. They have to contact, in the event of prior police work, they have to contact the prior police department to learn the reason of separation, also to learn the level of performance and if there was any performance issues when they were with the previous department, and that has to be reported to the commission.
Okay, and when such an officer comes before the commission, that person is not certified, or the commission would not certify that person as a police officer until after all that information is gained. And I guess the commission would vote on whether or not the person can become a police officer in Maryland.
Yes, sir, that is correct. The commission will not consider any aspect of issuing certification until all of those that I mentioned earlier have been completed by the hiring agency.
And bottom line, no one becomes a police officer in Maryland without going through your commission first. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Okay. My last question is to either of you. Delegate Barnes raised this earlier in terms of whether or not there is periodic psychological evaluations or assessments for police officers once they become police officers. And I think you indicated that, I think Sheriff Berry indicated that no, that is not true. It only happens after a traumatic incident when a police officer may be involved in a death or seriously bodily harm. My question to either of you is, if we were to put periodic psychological evaluations or assessments into state law, how long a period of time would you think would be appropriate? And number two, should it be an evaluation, or should it be a psychological evaluation or a psychological assessment?
Okay. Sheriff, you want to address that?
To Delegate Anderson's comment, it was actually Mr. Weaver who talked about that specific issue, but he was absolutely right in reference to we do the psychological evaluation once someone enters the entry-level law enforcement for employment, and then we do on a case-by-case basis if we have some traumatic event. I can speak to my agency if we have what is called debriefings. Reference to could be a significant, doesn't have necessarily use of force situation. If there was a significant car accident or a very traumatic event, we will do what is a debriefing, refer people to individuals to EAP, and we will also, if there is some issues that have been identified, that person will be referred to a psychological evaluation through a doctor that's associated with our agency. So it's on a case-by-case basis. But to that specific, if you're talking about doing something annually, some of the larger agencies, I think they will probably be able to meet that mandate, but I would love to be able to definitely kind of look at the fiscal note of such an initiative in reference to statewide mandate.
Okay. When is the next meeting of your commission?
That will be July the 8th. And if I can kind of follow up on that delegating issue from what the sheriff just mentioned, if you recall, when the commission was discussing exactly what you're mentioning, because there was a House bill that required, and I think it was part of House Bill 1016, that required a psychological assessment, evaluation, consultation. There was a lot of discussion about whether it should be a full assessment, a full evaluation, a full assessment, or a partial assessment, or a consultation. And I don't personally recall right now what the concerns of that was, but I do recall that an evaluation gets into the HIPAA rules, and it might prevent the professional from even releasing information to the agency on the individual being evaluated. So what I do recall is that it was some kind of a consultation. But again, that was limited to a serious involved incident, a traumatic incident, not on a periodic basis.
Well, at your next meeting, could you pose that question to the commission as to whether or not it would support periodic evaluations or assessments, whether it be annually or 3 years or 5 years? Because I understand that police officers have to qualify in using their handguns every year. So it would seem to me that there's already in place a periodic assessment of whether or not they are physically able to shoot guns in the proper way. I think that we ought to at least try to figure out if they have the mental acuity or capacity to still be the same police officer they were when we hired them. So my question is, if we were to do that, what period of time would you guys suggest? And would it be the assessment or would it be the evaluation?
Yes, sir, I can do that. They're, like I said, they're meeting on July the 8th.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You, Delegate Fisher has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a question. And in judiciary, I discuss a lot about the health of our officers, and I don't know if you have the data for today, but if you could get it to us, I would like to know information about how long the average Maryland police officer is on the force. What age do they usually retire? For what reason? Our racial breakdown of our officers, our gender breakdown per county, things like that would be really, really helpful. I think it would be good to know that, you know, the average Maryland officer is doing 20 years on the force. Are they doing 10? Is it 30? I think that would be really helpful as well. So I don't expect you to answer right now, but if you could come with that data, and that data with race and gender as well, per jurisdiction. I think we want to see what, at least, well, I know I can't speak for the group, but I would love to see where Prince George's, Montgomery County, and Baltimore City, and like Howard County compared to maybe some more rural counties. So that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. I have one final question, and it has to do with tasers. Does Maryland, or have you recommended, and I don't see it called out specifically in the best practices, use a policy related to using tasers, and as opposed to kind of folding it into a use of force? But do you have a recommendation that you've provided to all the law enforcement agencies that say this is when and how an officer should use a taser?
Okay, thank you, Delegate. The taser, what we refer to as electronic control device, ECDs, there is no out of use of force policy per se for just ECDs. It is incorporated in the total amount of tools that police officers have. And the primary basis of the training content is from the actual devices manufacturer on usage, and then the agency applies their use of force policy to that piece of equipment the same as they do for any other piece of equipment or tool that the officer may have.
So the training is from the manufacturer, and then the department folds that into their use of force policy.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. Any further questions from the group? Okay, seeing none, that ends the presentation. I would like to thank both the Sheriff Berry and Mr. Libno for presenting to us today. This concludes our work group meeting for the day. Our next work group meeting is tentatively scheduled for July 16th at 1 p.m. And there is a public hearing tentatively scheduled for August 6th at 1 p.m. Work group meeting information, dates, agendas, and the viewing links and contact information for the work group can be found on the Maryland General Assembly's webpage. So thank you again.
Thank you.